So we're on to week 6 now. Just to kind of, I always want to start by just putting it in a little bit of context. So we're now at blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, because they'll be satisfied. If we think about the Beatitudes as we're going through. And so this is the second time that we're going to unpack the issue of righteousness. So we thought about righteousness in terms of persecution, right at the beginning, and now we're looking at it in terms of hungering and thirsting for it. And just to kind of put it into immediate context, we had a couple of weeks ago, we were looking at the pure in heart, and purity of heart, which was also the integrity of truth. So there's a truth element to pure in heart, but also then we were looking last time at blessed are the merciful, and then the issues of kindness. If you're asked to go a mile, then go the extra mile. If you're struck on the cheek, then turn the other cheek. And actually, the power of unexpected kindness, which actually is a very, very, very powerful social dynamic. So these two ideas are kind of framing as we're running into hungering, thirsting for righteousness. Which I think was quite nice, because I suddenly thought, when I was thinking about it, I thought there's a kind of a nice grace and truth balance in the two of them. So I know this is a sub part of the Sermon on the Mount as we run through it, but we've kind of gone through something which is about grace, be merciful, turn the other cheek, don't claim your rights, etc. But equally, there's purity in heart, which is actually that your yes be yes and your no be no. There's something about keeping yourself, keeping your motives straightforwards. And as we're going to see a little bit, that purity of heart doesn't mean to say that we avoid. So for instance, there's a correct place for, if you like, for our sexual desires. So it's not that you don't have them; it's just that we keep them straightforward and simple, and we're not being clever with as we thought about it. And that's going to come into tonight as we look at how Jesus is going to use the kind of the classic issues. Which in Jewish thinking were about righteousness, prayer, fasting, and giving. He's going to unpack those things, and he uses them. He sets them up in a way where he effectively, we're going to explore the motives of those that do the right thing. So we've already kind of seen a little bit. You're kind of in the issues of purity of heart. You think you're doing it right, but you've got so sophisticated in the way you interpret the words that you've missed the point. That that actually it's okay to have sex with someone who's been divorced, but not if she's actually married, because if she's married, she actually belongs to somebody else. So therefore, you're insulting that person, and you're insulting God. That kind of logic that was creeping into the way that people were thinking religiously, and it's very kind of teenage, if I can put it that way. I spent some years as a youth worker. And the thing you'd often have is, it's kind of all these kind of questions that teenagers, how much can I do this? I remember one guy who's a lovely guy who's turned out really nicely. But I remember once I was mentoring him, and he'd come across the use of magic mushrooms as a hallucinogenic, because he had a drugs background, but they're not technically illegal to use. And he was trying to work out the uses where he might be able to make a little business collecting magic mushrooms, because they're not technically illegal, and selling them on. And the thing is, you're approaching it the whole wrong way when you're trying to kind of find the legal way through to do what you want to do. You're missing the spirit of those things. So what we're going to see tonight is Jesus unpacks the classic areas which every Jewish person thought of as being virtuous. I'm virtuous if I pray a lot. I'm virtuous if I fast. I'm virtuous as I give. And really kind of drill down to how and what is motivating us to do it. So we're going to revisit this later again, but I just want to I'm going to use the intro section, which is on fasting, just to kind of introduce the way he does it. So he says, now, so be careful not to do virtue for an audience. It's the actual Greek is don't do righteousness, but I figure that's a more modern way of saying it. Be careful not to do your righteousness for an audience or in public for the attention. It actually the Greek phrase is for people's gaze, for the gaze of people, for people to look at you. But I've used the word audience because Jesus, of course, is going to use the word hypocrite, which is actually a stage actor. So it makes more sense to me to gain their attention. Otherwise, you've got no reward from your Father who is in heaven. So it's not that he's saying doing the right thing for the wrong reason is a wrong thing in itself. He's just saying there's not really a huge amount of benefit to it. Because you're getting your reward now. So it's in many ways it's better that people do the right thing for the wrong reason. It's just not actually it doesn't actually establish and prove that I'm a really good person. I'm not growing into the maturity which we saw was the final phrase of last week when we came together. You be mature as your Father in heaven is mature. That's a phrase that we came across. I'm not that mature person if I'm just doing the right thing but for the wrong motives. So you could go kind of framing where we've been before. We've seen how massive an issue moral hypocrisy is when you look at social psychology. This construct with 1,000 faces, by which really what Jesse Graham is meaning here is that there are 1,000 different ways in which you can show this kind of layers of moral hypocrisy, and how they sort of manifest. So it's widespread and common, and Jesus is saying and recognizing that people will try to do the right thing, and it's very easy for this mixed layer, this lack of purity of heart, and to kind of creep into it. And the funny thing is, as the lack of purity of heart creeps into it, it actually becomes an unkind thing. As we'll see, you meet so many people who have been hurt by church, and very often they're hurt by people who seem to be doing the right things, but by doing them in the wrong way, it becomes a deeply wounding experience. And so it is a serious thing, if I put it that way, for good, healthy church life. It's not something we should necessarily want to ignore. So you remember these guys as well. Moral character predominates in person perception. I just keep reminding you because it just kind of it's this idea kind of pervades so much of the Sermon on the Mount. We're not just that we're doing it right, but we're doing it for the right reasons. Moral character is more important than warmth, and there are huge social trade-offs in being seen as moral, and that's particularly becomes relevant in this passage. Because obviously Jesus starts to talk about for people's gaze, for doing it in public. So doing immorality in public. So it's not surprising that there's a huge social trade-off to being seen as moral, because there's a clear link between serotonin and social status. So if society genuinely values people who adhere to certain moral standards, and they do, and that is of course why political correctness, everyone laughs at it, and now we refer to it as God, because it's kind of political correctness on steroids has become wokeism. We laugh at it from the sidelines, but actually it's very destructive and very powerful, because actually it plays into this need that we have to be seen as good, even though we're not really, because we get social status from it. And I won't kind of be unkind by kind of spelling out countless stories that you can probably pick out of the news from the last week, where you can see the kind of virtue signalling kind of things going on. But actually what we're going to think about is Jesus he's not sitting there wagging fingers at people. What he's going to do in the Sermon on the Mount is actually challenge us to reflect on and understand our own motives. Which kind of goes back, I don't have a slide for it here, but reminding us previous slides we've seen in previous weeks, but that the Johari's window, where we have the things that we're aware of and things that we're aware of but we don't share. But actually what Jesus is really hitting at is those things that we don't see at the moment. We don't yet see them. Perhaps others see them more clearly. We want to start to kind of come to terms with that and understand those better. So faking moral virtue is a cheap way to achieve prestige, which is why we do it. It's a really simple thing. We can take credit for things for moral things that aren't really ours, and equally we can present a picture that is often not really the truth. But it's actually, there is a bit, sorry, I've got a bit more. Yeah, and there's more, because it's not only is it easier to signal virtue than it is to be virtuous, but here's the really interesting one, which really unpacks that verse in Proverbs. Oh no, sorry, it's not in Proverbs. In Jeremiah, the heart is deceptive above all things. Who can understand it? But actually, here's the thing: if you verbalize that you're virtuous, it's actually been shown that verbalizing virtue is actually an effective strategy to help self-deceive yourself and suppress the feelings you have of your moral dissonance. So if I do tell lies, little lies, the way I see it. If I go around explaining to myself, really, when I'm explaining to other people, I'm also speaking to myself. In a weird way, our brain actually listens to the things we verbalize. So if I go around and I have gone through situations. I remember once, almost in despair, trying to explain to someone with some situation that was quite destructive. They said the trouble is that this person is so enamoured of their moral virtue that they cannot believe that they're doing something destructive. And that was the kind of phrase I remember using. And I'm not saying that it happens all the time, but unfortunately, that the same patterns I've seen time and time again, where and it's particularly true in kind of church circles where we've made an even higher level of virtue. That actually sometimes we are so we're so used to telling ourselves what good people we are. It's actually part of the process, which is what's been shown, what's been demonstrated. By verbalizing it enough, we really believe it. So we can't see the things in ourselves. And it helps and it's part of the way we offset the sort of the things that bubble up from the subconscious that kind of say, maybe not quite as honest as I could have been there. Now, I want you to hear, as I say all of this, as I've gone through a process, and there's a sense, and this is more than just academic for me. If it goes back a few years now, the nice thing is I can say with the qualification from my wife that I'm a different person to who I was 20 years ago. And part of that was because the Lord challenged me on some things, and I took it very seriously and very deliberately. And even to a point where I thought to myself, maybe I'm getting too navel-gazy about this, and maybe I did. But the point was, I think that there was a real benefit in the Lord helping me see and understand my own motives and so on. And I still now recognise I can have a tendency towards things, but at least I'm more conscious of it and I'm more honest with it in my dealings with the Lord, which actually somehow means that it allows His grace to kind of cover those sorts of things. And so when I say these things, I'm not saying it from kind of, oh, you should all be like me and so virtuous. What I'm saying is, where I find it complicated, I suspect others will find it complicated too. And what I found is that actually in part of this process, the Lord is very gracious in the way He deals with us by helping us through. So you notice He doesn't condemn people for doing the right thing for the wrong motives. He just says you're missing your reward. That your heavenly reward is somehow being compromised, as we see that kind of time and time again. So we end up believing our own propaganda as we kind of express those things, you know. The lady doth protest too much, methinks. That actually it is a very real, and I found out actually in sort of psychological counselling now. Very often the thing the analyst is doing is listen to the things that you talk about an awful lot, because they're a very, very good indicator of the things you're actually probably struggling with. So the things you're often expressing quite strongly, how you're in charge of, and actually how offended you are by people who do them, are often because those are the very things you're struggling with. Now, I'm saying that from a total place of grace, because I recognise that is part of the wonderful thing that the Holy Spirit has committed to doing with us, as we thought about that in Romans the other week. That it's by God's intention, by God's plan, that the Spirit should intervene with us because He understands us. So we just need to kind of stay open. But if we don't stay open, if we don't have that kind of sense of revelation. So anyway, so the good news is that Jesus' instruction can really help us untangle the real virtue from our mixed motives. And although what Jesus gives us is quite straightforward and simple, the wonderful thing is that the way in which Scripture speaks to every age and generation, and as our understanding of the world increases, we can take the principle and we can now apply it in a modern context and see it kind of more fully. So if we just go back to our phones, I want to kind of think a little bit about the fact. I'm just going to go over. Hang on, let's just go over here. Nice to see, folks. If I move on to the next question. What I want us to kind of start to do is to think as honestly as we can. So when I put here the little word awkward, but I'm thinking very often when we're thinking about doing the right thing for the wrong reason, it gets complicated when there are awkward situations. So can you name or describe an occasion when you might, I put in quotes there, obscure your truth for the sake of kindness? I could have put the word lie there, but then I would think, the problem is, if I put the word lie there, everyone would say, no, I never do that, so I can't think of any. But if I make it a little bit more euphemistic, obscure your truth for the sake of kindness. You see, well, sometimes what I want to drive at are those two things we saw a part of the framework. We are told to let our yes be yes, but we're also told to be kind. So, and actually, sometimes those two ideas conflict. The idea of kindness and truth. And so I'm just asking you to name or describe some occasions, and this is more than just throw your hellos around, because we need to start kind of understanding that actually Jesus recognizes, as we're going to see a little bit in terms of the way in which the flow of Scripture works, he recognizes that he calls us to live in a way where we live by positive principles, which sometimes come into tension, and those things are difficult. And so there are benefits to being seen as virtuous, which can sometimes compromise our sense of whether they really are virtuous or not. But I thought before we get there, I'm going to ask, can you name an occasion when you might obscure your truth for the sake of kindness? So, for instance, if someone invites you around for a meal and then says, "Are you enjoying your food?" and you're not really, that might be an occasion. You hear it? So I want everyone to try and think, and I really would ask everybody to see if you can come up with a scenario where you can feel the tension of, if you like, trying to live truth and kindness at the same time. Because actually we're going to see there is something about the psychology of this that actually kind of extends a little bit further. Can anyone think of those times? So I'll put that one in. So... Yeah. I hope maybe I didn't make these characters long enough. What a mess I made there. So it only gives you 25 characters. That's not long enough to write your answer in, is it? Okay, I'll put meal I don't enjoy. So we got about 5. There's a few more folks than that on tonight. So how many we? So there's a couple more folks. Anybody else would like to throw one in? We've only got 25 letters to do it. I don't want us to go to a meeting, but we don't know the buts here. Okay. Someone with BO. Okay. Yeah, we're getting very real. The point of this, the point of just putting the oops, hang on, I've gone the wrong way. The point of asking these questions is that the way in which funny enough, we were talking just beforehand, before everyone arrived. I was talking with Colin. We were trying to talking about the issue of slavery isn't particularly addressed as something to be got rid of in the Bible, and he was talking about someone who finds that a problem and can't listen to the rest of the Bible because it doesn't do that thing. The way in which God actually lays things out morally is very useful for us to try and understand. Is that he sets moral principles, and which sometimes do kind of create a bit of a conflict, which is actually why, and the funny thing is, people who study the Old Testament, increasingly you'll find that scholarship is on these issues is that the 10 words, or which we call the 10 Commandments, are about setting a direction. The actual the actual word Torah actually means to point at something rather than it being the destination. We come with a modern mindset where we see the words as the destination. So it says don't murder, or don't, actually it doesn't say don't murder, it says don't kill. So it says don't kill. And so we have this destination, which is I've never killed anything, and then one day I'm in a car accident, which means I have killed something, or killed somebody, say. And that's why in the Old Testament Moses has to appoint judges. So the judge's job is not to be the law. The judge's job is to say, when as I'm assessing you, and as you failed against the direction, but are you still heading in that direction? So that, if that makes sense. And so the approach to law is less about completion as it is about staying on course and in terms of direction. And I think the similar thing is sort of at play as Jesus is unpacking what he does, which is why I wanted to highlight the kind of issue of the grace, which is in kindness, embodied in kindness, alongside truth. That sometimes we've got those situations where you think, now, is what I just said fully the truth, if I put it that way? Well, that question to a degree depends on the context that you frame it with. So if I kind of be a little bit provocative, there are some people, I remember having this as a challenge myself when I was a young Christian, for whom make a big issue of the fact that Jesus says, for instance, at one point, that he's not going up to the feast, but then he goes up secretly. So they say, well, he's lied then, didn't he? See, that's how it goes. At one level, you can say, yes, he did. But at another level, that's just not human, is it? In other words, someone says, are you going up? And he says, I'm not going up. Okay, that's the truth. But then situations change, and in his humanity, Jesus changes and thinks, no, I will go up. And so he goes up. So it wasn't untrue when he said it, but actually as we extend the frame and we make the frame eternal, and if you think of it like that, then you can suddenly say, oh well, Jesus didn't tell the truth in that kind of context. Or for instance, if I take Richard Wurmbrand, for instance, Richard Wurmbrand lost a huge amount of support in US churches because of a question that he was asked on one occasion about how do you cope with when you're in a persecuted situation and the secret police come around and they're asking where people are and you know where they are, and how do you deal with that? And he said, well, I lie, I don't tell them the truth. And can you see that actually and so of course then he was saying, well, how can we have this person coming to speak at our church because he's a liar and he doesn't even seem ashamed of it? You see, it's just the way this kind of things work. But actually, it's not perhaps dissimilar to the concept, because what I want us to really undo tonight, or do tonight, is to really unravel the issue of how do we stay true in complex situations without feeling the levels of hypocrisy that we see Jesus warns us against. So the if you think about the bit where Jesus says, that you tithe your mint and cumin, but you ignore the bigger parts of the law, and you say, of the things that anything that's korban or dedicated to the work of the Lord, I can't look after my parents with that because I've already dedicated it to the Lord. In which case you've got your priorities wrong in the law. So you see, both of them are legal principles. Both of them are statements of truth. Both of them are directions. But he's saying it's still actually a human role to try and balance one against the other, if that makes sense. So I'm hoping that I'm not sounding like I'm backtracking the other week and saying, therefore, be a Christian sophist, kind of be clever with your words, because that's missing the spirit of it. It's not the spirit. It's saying there is a complexity, but we can sometimes hide in that complexity and be deliberately a little bit, and actually we're a bit rotten inside. Even though if you are totally true inside, you are still going to sometimes hit complex situations where, if you like, two principles seem to call for different things. That's okay. Just so you know what's going on, I'll come back to the text here. So when you do your acts of charity, don't sound a trumpet before you, like the hypocrite play actors do in the synagogues. I've translated that way because the word hypocrite, I thought we'd better put the word hypocrite in because we're so used to seeing it. But of course it does mean a stage actor or a play actor, someone who acts in a play. And there are theatres in Judea. There's one in Sepphoris. There's almost certainly one in Jerusalem, although of course it was destroyed, so we don't know where exactly it was. So, and Jesus uses the words because actually people are used to the idea. But actually, when Jesus used the words, he's already talked about audience. We saw that a couple of things before. There's something about the audience there. In other words, what Jesus is framing everything in this section about is the social benefit you get from the way people see you. Because it's about an audience, it's about you being a play actor, you're playing out in front of a stage, you're making everything big. It says, don't sound a trumpet like the hypocrite play actors do. Because actually in Greek theatre, there was a fanfare made. Technically it's not a trumpet. Normally the fanfare was played on one of these things, it's called an aola, which has a weird sound. It sounds like bagpipes. I actually looked up and found some playing earlier today. But generally the idea is when a character comes on, they're often announced with a bit of a fanfare. And so the thing is played, something is played, drums, things you blow through and so on. And obviously in Jewish culture, they're more used to the ram's horn, so perhaps that's why Jesus uses trumpet. But actually the play actor announces themselves as they come in. You do hear that kind of idea that maybe he's talking about some sort of receptacle in the temple, but we don't know if that's the case or not. So I think it's probably simpler just to understand. He's really saying, look, you're doing it all for an audience. Truly, I tell you, they have their reward. So that's the truth. That's the truth element. That there's an awful lot of what we present and we do in terms of who we are morally, and we're doing it for the wrong motives. And so while it might be good that we're doing it, we're losing our eternal sense of reward. So here's the interesting dynamic is that I put here the social consequences of the dilemma problem, of the trolley dilemma. The trolley dilemma is a kind of famous case, isn't it? We know it as a philosophical game where you can save 5 people by diverting a train and it kills 1 person. And it's fascinating from seeing the psychology of decision making. But all I wanted to draw out here is that when we actually test the impact when someone has to make a trolley dilemma decision, and they tested how this works socially, is that generally people don't like what we call consequentialists, by which I mean it's just about maths. So if you set up a kind of a psychological test which we kind of use the phrase the trolley dilemma as a generic term for these things, where someone has to make a difficult decision, which happens, say, for instance, all the time in wartime. In his journals, apparently, not that I've read them, but Winston Churchill talks about the pain of having to make decisions which mean that he knows that this boat is going to get sunk. This decision was almost daily in the war because the breaking of the Enigma code meant that the UK leadership was aware of attacks which that if they did something about, they would tell the Germans that they had cracked the Enigma code, in which case they would change the Enigma code and it would be worse. So they were stuck in this situation where they had to leave people to face almost certain death because they couldn't tip their hands for bigger strategic reasons. And this is what really I'm guessing at this kind of moral dilemma issue. But what happens is if you set up those moral dilemmas, trolley dilemma problems, and you get people to watch it, people do not like the consequentialists, i.e. they just do the maths and they make the decision. But they do like what they call the deontologists. Those are the people who actually struggle at how to make the decision. And that's interesting because I often think that a very legalistic approach to sort of the Old Testament law tends to be more consequentialist. It works it all out in terms of it's kind of, it's easy. It's dead easy. We don't allow the emotional struggle in. So just to quickly, some of you may be aware, I thought I better kind of do a definition. Here's the dictionary definition of deontology. It's the study in nature of duty and obligation. That's really dull and boring. More helpfully, I found this little description from ScienceDirect.com. Deontology is rule-based ethics, which focuses on duty and ethical principles derived from generally accepted rules. So stop and think about that. This is actually the way, as Christians, we are called to live. We have the 10 Commandments. We have the teachings of Jesus. So we've been given a set of rules, and we don't judge an action by its outcome. We judge it by actually, we include within our... Now, one of the rules might be that we should consider its outcome. That's true. But the point is the outcome is not the ultimate arbiter. It's just one of the rules that goes into the mix. Is that making sense? Hopefully that is. Using this perspective, researchers are said to be autonomous agents adopting positive values which give rise to a sense of moral duty. So you notice the emphasis on the rules which are positive, they set a direction, but actually sometimes, and this is generally understood from a philosophical point of view, is that approach to morality creates morally ambiguous situations which are complicated to unravel. Interestingly, back in the days of the Blair government in the UK, when he first came into power, there was a more deliberate shift, which I hadn't thought of it quite like this when I remember reading about it, a deliberate shift which was often pilloried in some of the press, towards an approach to setting laws where they recognised that there were ambiguities. There was a conflict between, if you like, my religious rights and my whatever rights, and the answer was, well, they're both principles that we believe in. We'll just let them sort out, and that's what the courts are for. And that sort of seems to be the way in which things worked in the Old Testament and through the periods of Jesus too. Actually, how does this kind of work out? I just thought we'd do one more little thing. I asked you to think about situations which are a bit more complicated when you think to yourself, how are we going to do these? So if you want to go back to your phones, it's going to set up a kind of another little kind of quick thing to report on, but this one will be slightly more sophisticated, because I'm also going to ask you to put your answers in, and then I'm going to ask us all to assess them. So it's anonymous. So you'll notice I'm not asking you to put names on these, so you can answer without your name on it. Okay. So I want you to think seriously about the scenario I just put here. So you're out with a friend and you find a £10 note. Okay. And there's nobody around, and your friend didn't see you find it. So my quick question is just simply, what do you do with the money? Okay, just trying to think, so what would I do with the money? I'm out walking along. There's some money. So you've come into some money. What do you do with that money that you've come into? There's no one else around. Try and think for your, and just be honest. Part of the journey here is actually asking ourselves questions like this. And kind of teasing them out. I'll keep talking while you think about your answers and put them in, but don't listen to me talking and ignore the question, because I want to have at least a few answers in there that we can respond to. But actually, on a personal counselling point of view, one of the things I often used to find was interesting with people who are often struggling with, I'm not sure what to do here, not sure what to do there, was I would ask them the question as, let's just imagine you won the lottery. And they say, well, I'm a Christian, I don't play the lottery. Okay, that's really nice. But just imagine you did. You suddenly got, so many millions of pounds. And what about your life would be different if you had that money? And actually, on a more therapeutic point of view, we got some quite shocking answers from people. Not that therefore I can put my hands up and kind of go, oh my goodness. But actually, what it did is it helped us bring out some truth. So playing these little games with ourselves is part of the way we start to understand ourselves. So if you'd like to put some answers in and see what we get to. Oh, hang on. I just realised. Let's go back. Oh, yeah, we've got some people in there, yeah. So we got spend it, talk about with a friend to decide what to do, pocket it, discuss with a friend, then do it. Thankfully, spend it on a coffee, probably keep it, not a fortune, in less realistic possibility of returning it to the owner. So now I set the question up. It's a little bit like the ultimatum game. It's interesting. Nobody here suggested splitting it. Did anyone say splitting it? No, we didn't have any splitting it there. But there's a little bit of voting. So I just thought let's just see. I gave you 3 votes, but because we've only got a few answers, just choose one of them if that's okay. What do you think would be one that you didn't write but you think is a good answer from someone else? Let's just see how it goes. So we've got a few possibilities there. So interesting. Spend it, pocket the cash, and say nothing and pocket the cash. We all got 0 votes on those. We got thankfully spend it on a coffee. That's a couple. Talk about it with a friend. Decide what to do. Probably keep it. It's not a fortune. I was very aware when I did this because of the numbers we have. It would probably be kind of quite small. Well, we've got some threes now going in. um, but what's really emerging is although there's a couple of really good answers there, but actually it was interesting that pretty much no answer appeared totally in isolation. We got the say nothing and pocket it or spend it or pocket it. So we had two pocket its and the spend it, which amount to about the same thing. Although they didn't get any votes because we don't see them as very virtuous. Oops, hang on, let me go back. Oh, sorry, I've just there we go. What I wanted to get across is that actually in a situation like this, it's a little bit ambiguous, and we're trying to make our choices, and depending on our history and a whole load of things about context, we might make slightly different choices. And in actual fact, how we do things is very difficult to pin down in terms of the action, if I can put it that way. This, as I say, it was a sort of a mini version of what's sometimes referred to as the ultimatum game, where if you give someone a certain amount of money and they've got a partner, they have to make a decision to split it with the partner. And if the partner agrees to the split, they can keep the money, and if they don't, then they don't keep the money. And if you like, the consequentialist thing to do, the logical thing to do, would be if I've got £10, I offer you I offer you £1 and keep 9, because if you do the logical thing, then it's better to have £1 than to have no pounds. But of course, people don't do that, you know. But what's interesting is the opening offer in the ultimatum game. When you look at it, there's 1,001 different answers, and that is because in a funny way we're playing this game where we're juxtaposing two ideas, and we're kind of balancing and trying to struggle with them to some degree. So come back here. And I've touched on this before, but now it's really bringing it home. See, it's very human, and we actually like people who follow moral rules, not just logical rules. In other words, we prefer people, and we would probably want this to be true of myself too, not to come too quickly to the logical conclusion. But we want to see them dealing with real emotional value and weight, if that makes sense. In other words, someone who in the ultimatum game offers me £1 and keeps 9, I think to myself, do you know what? It's not worth it. I'm gonna punish you by denying you £9. You see, so I say no. I'm not going to take that offer. But we will come to these different decisions even when we're trying to balance those things. It's me saying how much would. As I've got to mix your emotions with my emotions and how much I want and so on, it's not just going to be purely logical. I've got to somehow put them together. And what you can actually see in the brain is you're getting the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is, we saw right at the beginning of the first week, is the bit that extends. It's part of actually our ability to think about the future. It's part of our ability to it's part of the desire circuitry that makes us want to go for things that we hope for. It extends out of the emotional center, out of the amygdala, or the limbic system, the kind of the midbrain area. It extends out, and it then kind of interfaces with the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And it's at that point, what we find when people are making these moral decisions is they wobble all over the place, you know. And you remember I asked you to watch that video right at the very beginning, where he talks about those who have settled issues find it much easier. There's much more quietness going on in the brain. These are similar sort of areas that we're talking about, the things that have become settled for us. But this is really where the sort of spiritual battle is. And as we getting to know ourselves and understand ourselves and see the ways in which we do things, it won't necessarily tell you all the time whether you're doing the right thing or the wrong thing, because they are sometimes complicated. But you will get a better sense of yourself as you submit yourself to the Lord, and you'll probably manage it better, if I can put it this way. So it's an important area where the two come together. But there's an important thing to notice, which is the dorsolateral is the logical center. And 9 times out of 10, the logical thing is the right thing to do with these kind of decisions. So it's very easy to ignore the fact that there's this emotional balance and that's part of our humanity and just say we should do the logical thing. But actually, we become very unempathetic and very hard people if we're too much like that. I put here psychopaths think like Vulcans. So psychopaths don't really bring the emotional context into decision making. They just do it all in the frontal cortex, which is like Mr. Spock does, you know. And we don't like that. We're suspicious of it, not surprisingly. Because a psychopath wouldn't have a problem with pushing your kid in front of the train if it was going to save 5 other people. And we don't feel secure around them because we can't really anticipate them. They're not bringing that emotional kind of context into play. Now, I've spent a lot of time playing out with this because we're going to see it's quite complex when Jesus talks about your rewards for trying to be virtuous. Because it can create all sorts of complex little kind of circuits within us. There's an episode of Friends where Phoebe and Joey are trying to work out whether she can do something that's ever purely virtuous or whether it's always got a reward in it, and she mustn't feel reward because if she does, it's not really a good act. Therefore, and she's trying to find ways of doing something where she's getting no benefit but she still does the right thing, sort of thing. And actually that kind of joke is played out very often in kind of comedy. Is it really virtuous because after you got some benefits from it? So it's just worth us understanding this process a little bit and thinking about how it applies. So the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, that natty little acronym there, DLPFC, does actually do something very useful at the logical center. It does help you do the right thing when it's not easy. So it does play a real role, but it reduces the values, say, of people to numbers and statistics, which is why it has to work with the emotional center. And we've touched on this before. If you think too abstractly, you lose people's humanity. This plays out in so many scenarios that we understand today. So a good insurance company, for instance, is one that presents their insurance assessors with the humanity of the person who's making the claim. It has photographs of them, it puts them in the file, it gives you background and context, because it knows, as a good insurance company, that when we're dealing with the concept of a claimant, and we are sort of naturally as a company suspicious of a claimant, we put them in that place. It's important to include the emotional context so that our assessors and insurers will somehow bring both things to play, because otherwise we'll get a reputation. And then people will leave us. You see, that's the way it works. So they don't want to do that. So they want you to do the right thing. They want their assessors to do ultimately the right thing, but they do want to make sure it's properly emotionally considered. So we put it in here. You notice this frontal area is so incredibly complex. We touched on this before. Different types of brain tissue, different circuits, different layers of the brain, all kind of interacting. No, I forgot that I had to click through. And so in this mix, there is a kind of one of the things that it's just worth, let me go back, saying on this is it's not that one of the early findings in kind of neuroscience, goes back around 100 years or so, was that people who got damaged actually in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, in other words, that they failed to deliver emotions to their decision-making area, actually found it impossible to make decisions. So the funny thing is, you'll make decisions if you kind of damage the logical part. You'll just make emotional decisions. But if you damage the emotional thread into that, you don't make logical decisions. You just don't make decisions. You find it almost impossible to. So actually our emotions and the way God's made us are a very important positive part of how we make decisions. And you see, our emotions aren't illogical. They just sum up more information than we're able to cope with. The logical part of your brain can cope with about 6 or 7 variables tops. Maybe there are occasionally people who can manage with 8 at a time. But the emotional part of your brain is wired on things that take millions of bits of input, both past and present, and have blended those mathematically into solutions for you, and present them to you with kind of instincts and leanings and inclinations and feelings. And so they're not irrelevant. The two are very important. And in fact, if we're going to make decisions, we need to learn how the two work together. And there is a place where the way we think in the rational part of the brain does, as we've talked about before, how it whispers to the elephant. I mean, it can make a difference. But equally, when it comes to trying to do the right thing, we will find as we live by the positive principles, which is what a law system is, the 10 Commandments, the 8 Beatitudes, these are positive statements which we're aspiring to. We'll often hit these conflicts where there's so much information involved that we're having to try and do it in an emotional way, but properly moderated. And really, in many ways, you think, well, why am I trying to say all of this? Because what I'm going to conclude is it isn't easy. It comes with practice, and that's where we talk about wisdom, is people who have somehow learnt to cooperate in the process, slow things down, involve the Holy Spirit, try and bring their rational thoughts and the things they've learnt and the things they've decided on to play with the things that the instincts tell them they ought to be doing, and bring them together well. So Jesus puts it, when you do charity, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your charity is in secret. I think what he's driving at here is he's just said, look, don't do your charity to get attention. Okay, you want to try, because you don't want to lose your reward, your heavenly reward. But if we now try and really, really overanalyze it, if we try to know what my left hand, we try to let my left hand know what my right hand is doing, we actually get really wound up. We're never going to make a choice. And when it comes to charitable giving, it's better that we do a choice. But if somehow we can just say, okay, I don't fully understand that, I need to kind of lean into my instincts, go with my instincts, then at least we're going to make some decisions. And charity, probably like a lot of other things are, what's the right charity to give to? Well, if I get it wrong, it's probably not disastrous, assuming we're not giving to a charity that's kind of corrupt and sending the money to terrorists or so on. So it can stay relatively simple. So we need to keep doing these things. I'm not saying, says Jesus, that this is so complicated you stop trying to do the right thing. But just recognize when you're doing it that there are a complex set of motives to do with social circumstances, the way people see you, the way they put those things together. And actually you want to keep those things open before the Lord. As we saw in Romans, those are the things that actually the Spirit has committed to helping us with. And that's really the grace. So don't deliberately try and go for public approval, because actually then you get your reward. But as we're trying to think it all through and trying to do it so virtuously that there is no reward, well, we're not going to achieve that, if I put it that way. So in one sense, don't get too hung up on letting your left know what your right hand is doing either. We just got to kind of go with it, and that's the grace, but we kind of do it in that way. So just to remind us then, things that Jesus didn't say. Okay, so here he is just thinking, oh, no, I can't believe they thought that. He doesn't say, for instance, any benefit you get from righteousness cancels out its real value. So I just want to kind of get so Phoebe is totally wrong. Okay, it's not virtuous because you don't get any benefit from it. Okay, there's no problem if you get a benefit from it, and we're going to see in actual fact, from a psychological point of view, there are a lot of benefits to doing the right thing. Okay. He doesn't say don't acknowledge other people's good deeds. You'll disqualify the benefit for them too. And that middle one, I have seen at operation in church too many times. Sorry if I get frustrated with this. Where people, it's like where someone does something that's really good, and well, we don't want to tell them, we don't want to kind of get them puffed up and whatever. But Jesus never says you disqualify people because you actually acknowledge it to them. Virtue is only valid if it's thankless and painful. Jesus never says any of that. He just says, as you're going into it, be wary of the fact that sometimes in our motives we are doing it for not necessarily really good reasons. And in fact, sometimes we can, unfortunately, when we get too comfortable and easy to accept the fact that people assume we're really good and moral all the time, it can actually sometimes be quite painful and damaging for people who are in contexts like that, particularly when they discover the truth. The pain of betrayal, I can't remember if I said this when we're looking at purity of heart. The pain of betrayal psychologically is interesting from most pains. It's different from most pains in that it doesn't, betrayal doesn't heal over time. Betrayal comes from is healed by rebuilding. So just want to hear that for a second. Most pains will diminish over time and you can get over with them. Betrayal has a unique feature, which is that people get over it by rebuilding. They don't kind of get over it just by waiting, if that makes sense. And actually this issue of hypocrisy in our virtue is one of the things that can be really disappointing. It's caused me my greatest crises of faith. It's just me being really blunt, where I've heard testimonies. And the fact there was a story this week, I don't know all of the details of it. It's come out and people are complaining because it looks like the EA was complicit in not actually being totally honest. But the EA is saying, well, the trouble is we actually had signed a non-disclosure agreement when we were starting to uncover the truth of the story behind this with an evangelist whose story looks like it was a totally made up story. I'm just saying looks like because I don't know all of the details. But actually it was things like that when I was a younger Christian that actually made me seriously kind of edge towards losing my faith. So these things are very serious when they go wrong, if I can put it that way. They have real implications. It's only, but flip side is we don't get so hung up on it in the sense of it doesn't matter too much if we do get some value from when we do something virtuous. I just need to watch my heart that that's not the primary reason I'm going for it. I found this little thing. It's David Linder's a neuroscientist who's looking at the whole issue. He's a kind of consultant into the charity world. And he makes the point that social status is probably still the main motive for giving to charities worldwide. When I was, I lived in the States for 8 months, and the guy, one of my closest friends out there, I went back a few years later and met up with him. He had a manufacturing business. He was a kind of an artist when I knew him. He'd kind of become a manufacturer. And the mainstay of his income was certificates and plaques and so on in what he referred to as honour walls. You know, someone gives a charity donation, they get their name carved on the wall, or they get a certificate, or they get some trophy or whatever. And that is the reality. That charities actually do need to kind of play with that. The fact that people will give, their primary motive for giving is the social status they get from it, which is why they host public functions and they honor donors publicly. They put their lists up and so on. It's just there. It's just so it's real. So and we don't want to get critical of them for doing that, because if they're genuinely doing a good job, they're feeding money to orphans somewhere. Then do you know what's more important, that the orphans get fed, or that actually we kind of say you should have done it all anonymously and you'd have only made £10, but at least the orphans would have had a pure £10, if I can put it that way. But moreover, when scanning people's brains in an fMRI scanner, everybody's pleasure reward circuit lights up when the tester talks about the testee's good, kind actions. In other words, you go into these things, if people recognize your virtue, you will feel good about that. And that doesn't matter who you are. Don't pretend you don't, we will feel good about it. So I have to recognize that. Doesn't matter who you are. If they want to stick your head in the scanner, they will see pleasure circuits going when people start to talk about and acknowledge the good and kind things that you've done around you. So that is a reality to why stuff gets done. But somehow Jesus is saying, be aware of that and don't just do this for that reason. Try and focus on actually something about your heavenly reward to kind of keep it pure, because when it becomes corrupt, this issue of becoming hypocrisy becomes very, very damaging to folks. So virtue is its own reward. That's said by Marcus Tullius Cicero. Virtue is its own reward, but with perhaps a caveat. Here's the thing, the pleasure doesn't always flow upwards. And here's an interesting little tension in the mix. I put this little model of Maslow's hierarchy of needs up at the beginning, and I kind of related to The bottom layers are about physical satisfaction. When my body is satisfied, when my I think of that as pleasure, or in this case, when people are talking about my rewards, I feel pleasure and emotionally, which we often refer to as happiness. But that top level, the kind of the deepest level, is beyond both of those things. And I put here, pleasure doesn't flow upwards. As with all things, if I seek pleasure, I don't achieve happiness. If I seek happiness, I won't necessarily achieve that top level, which includes righteousness, peace, joy. But if I have happiness, if I'm happy, most things are more pleasurable. Food actually tastes nicer if I feel happy. Similarly, if I have righteousness, peace, and joy, I will be happier in more situations. Do you see how they flow down, but they don't climb up? So we all know the truth that lives that are devoted to chasing pleasure are very, very, very rarely happy. Lives that are which are all about pursuing happiness very rarely achieve that kind of top level where you know that you've done it the right thing the right way. It's perhaps the simplest way of understanding that self-actualization level in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so what Jesus is really saying is not a problem if you enjoy the lower down layers. It's just that if you make the pursuit of that what you're doing this thing for, if your virtues are some of the things that potentially give you the top layer, if you do them purely for happiness, you're never going to realize the top layer. And so you'll never fully understand why you did it. I don't know if I put it in. I contemplate putting a quote from Cardinal Newman in the slides, but I don't think I did in the end. Where he actually says pretty much the same thing as I've just said. He said, if you pursue the pleasure you get from doing good as an end in its own right, you end up not getting the benefits of what the pursuit of it was all about. It's effectively the same idea. So it's not that the thing itself is bad, that you got pleasure from it, that you got a bit of a reward. But if that's the only thing you're looking for, then somehow you miss the deeper level. But here's an interesting kind of tension in the mix. Because our reward circuitry, which we just put up on the slide, can be activated by things that are not intrinsically pleasurable. Okay. And our beliefs play an important role in that. Again, this is out of the kind of the papers and stuff written by David Linden as a neuroscientist, but it's not dissimilar to what we've touched on already. And we're going to see that comes out particularly, for instance, in fasting. So I'll say it now because we're going to run through the almsgiving, prayer, and fasting. Fasting is the denial of a pleasure. Okay, so eating food is pleasurable. Okay. Fasting is not pleasurable, but actually it can be more satisfying. And actually that's a really useful thing to notice, that we get a greater sense of satisfaction if we fully own at a rational level, we've kind of settled at the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the logical center, that this is something that is important to me. And that makes sense of what Jesus has said when he talks about our rewards in heaven. If we've settled that I have heavenly rewards in my prefrontal cortex, I can actually feel pleasure from doing something that isn't really pleasurable. And more than that, I can also get happiness from something that wasn't pleasurable, but it never flows up anyway. And more than that, I will actually find it's what I build that sense of actually I've done life the right way. And so it's actually the pleasure that is derived from those kind of counterintuitive beliefs that make what Aristotle refers to as eudaimonic happiness, happiness of spirit, good-spirited happiness and joy. In other words, it's the thing that attains those higher levels. So it is purely, if I can put it in an abstract way, when Jesus says, think about your rewards in heaven, I don't get any pleasure from my rewards in heaven. They're an abstract idea, which if I really believe in them, actually then I don't find it so hard to fast, even though I don't get pleasure from eating, but I get a greater sense of satisfaction, that kind of top-down flow from the truth of that. And that is not just, if you like, a Christian principle, it's a human principle. We get that greatest sense at the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We're meeting them most when the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is feeding something into the mix with the ventromedial, which is all about my emotions, which might make me happy, if you like. And so we don't, that's why in the end, very often we want to come to the logical decision, but we don't want to get there too quickly, because then we don't look like proper deontologists who are taking positive principles the right way, and nobody likes that. So I'm trying to kind of, in one sense, play out tonight, probably from my point of view, first time, what for me are lots of years of mulling over things from a sort of psychological, philosophical point of view. So I'm hopefully I'm conveying correctly some of what it kind of what feels to me to be feeling my way forward in the right sort of direction, if I can put it that way. So your Father who sees in secret will reward you. So do I know it? Do I know that he rewards me? Because actually that I won't feel as a pleasure. I won't necessarily feel it as a happiness. I know it as an idea that sits at that top level of my needs. It's going to feel quite wavery compared with all that emotional things that come in, all those emotional reasons. But if I can find a way of telling the truth most clearly, even when kindness might want to make me find a simpler way to kind of avoid it. If I can find a way, I start to identify and say, no, I am someone who tells the truth, and I have a reward in heaven because I'm telling the truth, and I might get into trouble for telling the truth now, etc., etc. Actually, those are the things, as we put those things in place, we really feel the long-term life benefits from. So believe that God sees you. Jesus adds, your Father sees in heaven. And so that's why it's really important in one sense to keep a good prayer life going, because actually it's often in our prayer life that we know the truth of our connection with the Lord. He is far more present with us if I'm in daily connection with him through prayer. And actually if in my prayer I sense his love and I feel those things, then actually that heavenly reward starts to kind of win over in the battle between those different parts of who we are. So we just get back to the text. So charitable giving, prayer and fasting, they're the three big staples of Jewish religious life. They were understood as being expressions of Deuteronomy, 6:5. You love Yahweh your God with all of your heart, which is they thought of as prayer, with all of your soul, which they talked about as fasting, because the Hebrew word for soul is actually a body, or it's a unity, it's a person. All your soul, and with all of your might, which they saw as your finances, your wealth. So therefore prayer, fasting and giving, alms giving, were ways in which you were showing that you loved the Lord your God with all of those three different dimensions. And so Jesus kind of unpacks them. He's got with a basic formula. So when you insert your righteous act here, don't be a stage actor. Truly I tell you, there's a reward, do it secretly, because your Father who's in secret is going to reward you in secret. And that formula is there for all three. But you could abstract it from Jesus' day and think about our world. And actually, we have the similar challenge. We kind of perhaps codify what we see as virtue in slightly different ways, although they tend to come in around the same issues. So you could put any of those things in there. When I'm doing it, try not to do it with my attention on those people who are seeing me and looking at me and performing for them. Because I tell you, that actually you have your reward in full. In other words, if I'm getting pleasure and that's my only objective from it, my objective was to get pleasure and I got pleasure from it, I have the pleasure for the moment. If I'm somehow looking and doing it for the Lord, I might still get pleasure, but somehow I've not therefore denied the truth of the reward beyond. And that's where it's slightly different from sometimes the way it's understood. It's kind of, if you get any pleasure from it, somehow you've taken away the benefit. Because your Father who is in heaven, who is in secret, will reward you in heaven. That's the formula. It's there, and that's true of all of the things we do that are good. Somehow we want to bring that attitude to it. Okay, primarily I'm doing it for him. I might get some benefits, or I might not. I might even get persecuted for it, but I'm doing it actually out of my relationship with him. So all three start with that common formula. So when you do charity, prayer or fast, don't sound a trumpet, stand in public and make yourself look gloomy. See? like the stage actors do. Okay. So they all kind of point to this kind of common conclusion, which is you strip the practice of morality from its out of its social status benefits, and you'll desire it for its own heavenly sake. And again, to talk a little bit out of personal experience, I've actually found there is a kind of there's a sort of a spiritual discipline in this. And as you more you break through, it's not that you've broken through and you'll never slip backwards, but actually it becomes easier the more you break through. By which I mean is as you start to understand the spiritual benefit, the spiritual reward of trying to do the right thing, trying to speak honestly, even when you're moderating and tempering it with your kindness, or in all of those sorts of ways, as you start to try and put those things in place, and the first few times it seems really hard, but the more you do it, the greater the sense of ownership of the benefits of the heavenly reward start to come into play. So, if we think in terms of the coach the elephant model, there's a kind of a sense in which the rational part is we develop an awareness of heaven, and we remind ourselves of the heavenly rewards. If we're conscious of, if we're consciously putting into place the disciplines of prayer and so on, that we're seeing the reward of that, and we're kind of acknowledging it, because actually as that becomes more real to us, it plays a bigger part in the balance between the emotional part of the brain and the logical part, because it comes from the logical part. It's an abstract thing. It will have more weight, and we'll find it easier as something that moderates and leads our decision making. So at the emotional layer, one of the things to do is actually sometimes to notice the basic benefits, because actually one of the things we find, or we're going to unpack those in a minute, but I probably put this slightly out of order. There is a reward to doing good things which we feel emotionally, and so if we notice that, how good it makes us feel, what a warm feeling it gives us, and we kind of say, oh yeah, I recognize that feels really good. As we take some time to notice that, we're also kind of, if you like, priming the emotional side of who we are as well as the logical side, so that they're bringing both things together. And in the kind of change the environment, the present context, obviously if we can minimize the social benefits, we try and do things as anonymously as possible. But then we don't get too fearful about being seen either. It's not that we become manic about these things, but if we recognise, if we play down the opportunity to get seen, we won't kind of feel the secondary benefits too much, and they won't play too big a role. So as we kind of put the different bits together, we try and before the Lord, then we work out so that we're not just doing the right things, but we're something about us is doing it the right way, which makes us as individuals, and I do mean this seriously, I don't want it to sound like I'm perfect in this, because I'm not. I'm sure I'm terrible at these things, but actually the kind of the way I remember seeing it in a sci-fi book once, someone was referred to as being the type of Christian who didn't make you feel bad because Jesus was their best friend. There's something about actually how we do our righteousness in ways where we're not kind of feeding ourselves out of it, but it is actually we're doing it for the right reasons. And I think people do notice it differently. They do experience it differently. So just very quickly as we run through almsgiving, we'll look at the psychology and sociology of each of these things. I've tended to try and give you an idea of what the rabbis were teaching in Jesus' day. So these quotes from the Wisdom of Sirach, which is better known as the book of Ecclesiasticus. Not Ecclesiastes, but Ecclesiasticus. It's an intertestamental book, so about 200 years before Jesus it's written. Jesus actually quotes from it in one of the Gospels, so it's clearly part of the background and context. And notice what it says: a common way of thinking, giving to the poor can make up for sin, just as water can put out a blazing fire. That isn't necessarily gospel, just so you know that. Count among your treasures the fact that you give to the poor. It will save you from all kinds of trouble. I don't think it's necessarily true. I say necessarily. I'm not wanting to be too judgmental on it. But I do know the emotional feeling of that, which is when I felt like I've let myself down hugely. I'm far more susceptible to someone making a request for finances in a meeting. I literally give my biggest gifts, or I used to. This was going back some years. I'd give my biggest gifts at the time when I'd had my biggest argument with Judith or something like that. So I feel like I'm not a very good Christian. and now I've got an opportunity to give some money and I feel better about myself. So I understand the human layers to it, but it's interesting because Jesus does take a different approach actually in this. So the understanding in the rabbinic thinking was that the Ecclesiasticus, or the Wisdom of Sirach, same book, was seen as being an exposition of this Proverbs. Riches don't profit in the day of wrath, but righteousness delivers from death. So that actually there's something about the righteousness that delivers from death. So if we can just do these things, we can do enough prayer, if we can do enough fasting, if we can do enough giving, then actually that can cover an awful lot of sin. So a lot of righteous acts covers an awful lot of sin, but Jesus doesn't particularly say that. He's going to go on to say, note this: if you forgive people their slip-ups, your heavenly Father will forgive you as well. Will also forgive you. So Jesus does actually say there's something we can be involved in, but actually it is in the flow of forgiveness. So actually there is something that helps cover. But actually it's not your giving. It's not that you give excessively and you give lots of money. There is a place, we hear it in Jesus' teaching. I was hungry and did you feed me? That there is that thing where actually there isn't a place of our acts, but actually the real kind of heart of the things is Jesus casts it slightly differently from the teaching of his day, which is if you give a lot, then that will cover a lot. Actually, he's saying the giving is more about the forgiving rather than the money, which is accessible to the rich and poor alike. You can both do that. So now be careful not to do your virtue for an audience to gain their attention, otherwise you get no reward from your Father who's in heaven. So when you do acts of charity, don't sound a trumpet. We've read those verses. But when you do charity, don't let your left hand know what your right hand's doing, so your charity's in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. So then he goes on to prayer. So just looking at the science of prayer. So I've got a couple of quotes. He's a Jewish scientist, assistant professor of psychology at Harvard Medical School, Dr. David Rosmarin. So I've found a few quotes, pulled a few things together. Actually, from the top of the screen there, let me get rid of that so you can see. It's the Association for Psychological Society, the American Psychological Society, APS, that reported this. I found this report in there. Scientists have no way to measure the existence of a higher power, of course. Prayer is hard to study, but it has been studied. It's hard to study. Prayer can calm your nervous system, shutting down your fight or flight response mechanism. And I just realised that's what I thought I was missing. I had some quotes somewhere. I'm sure it's really odd. They seem to have disappeared. I put some quotes in about actually why my charitable giving is good for you, why you get benefits from it. So in a similar way. So it is good for you. There is a natural high that comes from it. But prayer can calm your nervous system, shuts down your fight or flight response. It can make you less reactive to negative emotions and less angry. So this is stuff that has been studied. Although, as he says, it's hard to study. And the reason it's hard to study is, unlike meditation, where people just sit in a single space and they can wire them up and kind of modify, measure a lot of real prayers will pray while they're walking around doing all sorts of things and so on. So it's not as easy to study as meditation is. But it does have those positive effects on us. So there are some positive benefits, see, and we can enjoy them, but of course that's not the main reason we're doing them. He goes on to explain there's a 2005 study in the Journal of Behavioural Medicine comparing secular and spiritual forms of meditation. He explains that, sorry, I should give you context, because it's hard to measure prayer in active sense. They often look at it in terms of meditation from a spiritual or secular, by which he means secular meditation is kind of I am love. I'm meditating on positive things, and we all know that meditation is proven and shown to be good for you. But the thing that's interesting here is spiritual meditation. Why I meditate on scripture, or I meditate on a spiritual concept like God is love, is actually better than meditating on nice positive things generally. So after 4 weeks of daily meditation, either on a spiritual verse or an idea like God is love, people who are doing the spiritual meditations have far better effects than those who are just doing the secular ones. Both of them are better than if you don't do anything, that way. But actually, the spiritual content model is more effective. So after 4 weeks, Those who were doing the spiritual meditation saw greater decreases in anxiety and stress than secular meditators. They also saw bigger increase in positive emotions. And here's the interesting one. They tolerated pain for nearly twice as long when asked to put their hands in a nice water bath. So actually, genuinely, prayer and positive focus on the Lord is probably going to have real good benefits for you if you do it. But that's not the reason we do it. You hear the see, there's spiritual reasons. Sorry, there's kind of prestige reasons we don't do it for that, and there are probably kind of benefits to me, and that's not because I'm doing it for that, but that's a nice side effect. But I am actually genuinely doing it to engage with the Lord, because actually that's the right way to do my life. A little bit more, Professor Frank Fincham. So here you go. This guy here, he is an Orthodox Jew. He actually wrote a book. I put it down here, The Handbook of the Torah and Mental Health. So he obviously believes a very similar thing to me, which is I'm stunned by how much in Scripture has good psychological benefits to it. That seems to be one of his kind of his underlying logic in who he is. Professor Frank Fincham is also a Christian as well. But he's at the FSU, Florida State University College of Human Sciences. So studies at the Florida State University found that when people pray for the well-being of their spouse, so it's good for your marriage, in other words, when they feel a negative emotion in the marriage, both partners, the one doing the praying and the one being prayed for, report a greater relationship satisfaction. So here's more positive reasons that you can do. You could be praying because actually it's good for your marriage. So there are benefits. There are real benefits. But when you pray, don't be like the hypocrite play actors who love to stand praying in the synagogues on the corner of the streets to be seen by people. Truly, I say to you, they have their reward. So part of the reason I spent so long at the beginning talking about the complexity of trying to unravel these things and saying why it is in the end we say, don't let my left hand know what my right hand's doing. Part of that, I think, is saying, you know what? You could now get all panicky and say, oh, I can't pray because I know I'm getting a benefit. Psychologically, my blood pressure's just gone down because I've been praying. Therefore, it's not somehow worth it. Well, that's all the complexity of it. Yeah. If you just pursued that, you're missing it. But it's quite nice. I find it as an additional kind of add-on to making my decision to pray, to recognise, you know what, this would be really good. I know when I close my eyes and I turn my eyes and focus on the Lord, I will find a whole load of things lifting off me. That's one of the secondary benefits, if you like. And that secondary benefit makes it easier for me to make the choice to pray. But when you do pray, enter your inner room, and having shut your door, pray to your Father who's in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And in praying, don't talk with tedious repetitions like the Gentiles do, because they think they'll be heard for their many words. Don't be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him. The thing I really take from those verses is that what it shows you is that the Lord has a commitment to us. That actually he's not looking for us to perform for him. He does want us to come to him, as we're going to see in the words. He does want us to approach him, to engage with him. But he's not looking for us to perform to him. We're not performing for an audience. We're not having to perform for the Lord because he understands. Now, I've had so many of these little discussions in evangelistic situations when I was in younger days, used to do beach missions and other things where people would actually kind of say, well, if the Lord knows what I need anyway. In fact, I remember at university, a friend who did become a Christian, which is really nice, said, but if God knows anyway, why would I need to pray? If he likes me and wants to do it for me, he'll do it, won't he? But actually there is the situation was slightly different. It wasn't someone, they sort of became a Christian. But actually the funny thing was I kind of explained to them how it's actually the Lord likes us to kind of, she actually got sick. She used to live next door to me and she actually got sick. And I thought now is a thing where I need to kind of put my money where my mouth is. And I offered to pray for her. And I prayed a long prayer, it says don't pray. But while she had toothache. She'd had it for days. So I said, do you mind if I pray for you? And so she said, yeah. And she thought, I said, no, I'd sit here and pray for you, because she thought I meant go away and pray. So I prayed for her, and she started chewing on her tooth. And while I was still praying, she said, does it always work this quick? But it kind of was like that. It brings home that actually there is even though he does know what we need, he does somehow require us. It changes something when we come into relationship with him. So when you pray like this, our Father who's in heaven, hallowed be your name. We honour his name. We put him in that place. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as in heaven. We acknowledge that on earth things are different from the way they are in heaven. But equally, from a Jewish perspective, if we'd be familiar with Psalm 103, where praise Yahweh, you angels of his. So up in heaven, hallowed be your name on earth as it is in heaven. In heaven, the angels who are his mighty strength, who fulfill his word, obeying the voice of his word. Praise Yahweh, all you hosts, all his servants of his, to do his pleasure. On earth, I am his angel. The word angel can be used for a human because actually it doesn't mean divine. It just means God's messenger. I can be God's messenger. So if God wants to do something, he's looking for those who are obeying him. In heaven, his word is getting done by his angels. On earth, maybe I'd start to see my role and responsibility in it. And I have to pick those things up and work out how to deal with it. We can ask for needs, give us our daily bread, forgive us our debts as we have forgiven our debtors. And don't carry us into trials, but draw us away from evil, for yours is the kingdom, power, and the glory. I put that note how Jesus prays in Gethsemane, where he said, he says to the Lord, he prays, don't take me into trial. Don't take, if this cup can pass from me, I would, but not your will, but mine, So actually, there are those things where it's quite legitimate to pray for things that even in the end the Lord knows we have to go through, but in our humanity he understands when we say we don't want to go through this, even when we do have to. But it's good to put it to him because you never know how those things will play out. So if you forgive people their slip-ups, your Heavenly Father will also forgive you. I do these on the Wednesday afternoon. I've been working through Matthew's Gospel, and I'm a bit ahead of where we're doing these tonight. The translation here, every word, some of them are slightly unusual. You think, why have you done that? They're all legitimate, so they're all, so none of these are kind of like totally made up. It's not kind of like it's not even sense for sense. The word for forgive people's trespasses, the English word trespass means to step away or step off, because the actual Greek is to kind of stumble sideways, which is why I've gone for slip ups. Trespass was stepping off the path. So it really does mean something like slip ups. So forgive people their slip ups as your Heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you don't forgive people their slip ups, neither will your Heavenly Father forgive your stumbles. Now here's an interesting thing. I won't go into it too much theologically, because there are different styles of sin in the Old Testament, and slip-ups is most like the missing the mark idea. It's kind of it sometimes it's not always what you intended, but it's where you've ended up. But let's not spend too long there, because we're already 1 minute past 9. And we're just coming, don't worry, we're on the home stretch now, fasting. The benefits of fasting. There are benefits, human benefits. If you fast, by which I mean intermittent fasting, which you can eat a bit during the day, a bit like Muslims do at Ramadan, or we're supposed to do it at Lent, but we've forgotten to. What they mean by intermittent fasting is we have periods where we're not eating and then we can eat a bit, and then periods. Actually, that can kickstart the production of ketones in body fat, or from body fat, I should say. So what happens is your glucose levels, as they go down, because you're intermittent fasting, and your body doesn't know how to predict when they're going up again. So it kind of clicks on and says, okay, I'm going to start producing extra energy from your body fat, which is the process of ketosis. And they're actually better brain fuel than glucose. So they actually allow your brain to stay alert for longer periods of time. So actually there's simple, basic physiological benefits. And studies also suggest that the level of neurotransmitters associated with concentration, such as noradrenaline, orexin, they're actually higher when you're fasting. So you get this kind of double benefit. The fuel that is going to your brain is actually being produced out of your body fat, which is good obviously for your weight. But actually that fuel is much better at longer periods of concentration and alertness and so on. At the beginning, as your glucose levels go down, you feel pretty grotty, But actually, if you can get through the grotty place, you're actually in a very kind of high sense of alertness and so on. It also gives you enhanced. So fasting is good for you. Enhances your neuroplasticity. So because actually, when you're in that state of ketosis, where you're being fed by broken down fats, and you're alternating between different ways of actually getting brain energy, because you might eat a bit of food that gives you glucose and so on. It actually encourages brain plasticity, by which we mean that actually the brain starts building more neurons, which allows it to kind of actually work more efficiently and rebuild new pathways and so on. So actually, you enhance neuroplasticity, keep your brain actually active and alert and healthy by the practice of fasting. And it's also good protection against depression, because actually one of the things you do know is in everyone who has got depression, you have very low levels of BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So it's a protein that is in the brain. So people with with depression have very low levels of it. And one of the things you do know is that fasting actually kickstarts and creates it starts producing that protein. So you'll see an increase in that protein level, which can only be good for your mental health. So there's lots of good physical and mental reasons for fasting. And also, interestingly, of course, as I said, it works as a kind of a workout for the brain's ability to replace physical pleasure for that kind of higher functioning pleasure that we were talking about earlier, i.e., as Jesus puts it, your rewards in heaven. Because we're actually practicing, I'm not getting physical pleasure right now because I'm not eating that juicy pile of chips. But actually I'm feeling a greater satisfactional style of pleasure because I know that I'm doing this for the Lord. Does that make sense? So actually it's a good kind of practice of that, puts it in practice. So there are real benefits that aren't just about the social, but again, as I said, all the way through, if we pursue them for those benefits, we stop at that level, we peak at that level. But actually, if we recognize why we're doing it for the higher level, actually we will find there's a kind of a flow down. So whenever you do fast, don't be like the sad-faced hypocrite play actors. Again, the imagery is still the same. Greek theatre, they have their masks on. Their made-up faces to signal fasting to people. Truly I say to you, they have their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head, wash your face, so you don't signal fasting to people. But your Father who's in secret, and your Father seeing in secret, will reward you. So the spiritual disciplines all have earthly and heavenly benefits, so long as we pursue the right things in the right way, if I put it that way. So prayer is about what goes up to God, alms is about what goes out to others, fasting is about what goes into us. And all of those are actually elements which we saw right at the beginning. They're kind of dimensions of our moral understanding, of who we are. And we don't need to be worried about the fact we get benefits from doing things. We just don't want to make that the priority. We don't want to kind of peak at the level we set. We somehow want to really set that spiritual reward, which is a little bit nebulous the way Jesus describes it. But that doesn't mean to say that we can't in ourselves become more confident of it. And as it becomes more confident of it, we actually find that kind of starts to work its way into all sorts of elements of how we do life. So I feel, again, we've not done too badly, seeing as we started quite a few minutes late this time. I think that's it was my final slide that I'd put in. So thank you for taking part. Does anyone want to ask any questions or say anything or comment on anything? It's always nice when people do. It makes me feel like people have found it engaging. So anyone want to ask or comment or share anything?
One thing I was just going to say was on a slight tangent, but I love that picture of that statue of Jesus, sort of. I don't know what that statue, so holding his head in sort of despair.
Face palming,
we misunderstand. I think it'd be a great thing for a sermon. Just show that picture and start talking about how we've misunderstood whichever passage it is.
Yeah, and then Jesus must think, what on earth did they get that idea from what I said from him? So I thought I'll go. I thought I'll go and find one of those images because I've seen things like it before. But yeah. Anyone else want to make a comment after Peter's very helpful?
I love the when we just talk about these things and we talk about the psychological benefits of these higher levels.
Yeah.
Of existence, it so much makes more sense to your faith. That without the faith, what's the reason for these higher levels of benefits? This prayer, this fasting. What's the point of fasting?
Yeah,
a Christian.
Yeah,
there are these benefits, sure, but why? You say if you're just an animal, if you're just a machine,
Yeah. Why is it there? It's so key to our humanity, isn't it? It's like that statement that C.S. Lewis used to say is if I have an itch that isn't satisfied by anything in this life, it tells me that I was made for something outside of this life. And I think it's a similar sort of thing, that actually we find ourselves being drawn upwards, and unless we put those things in place, we don't feel a satisfied life. Yeah.
Yeah. He talked about the great myth, didn't he? Christianity, the great myth.
Yeah.
All of us are drawn towards, and it's the same thing here. It's the truth of Christ, and these truths which we're discovering, they are all pointing towards each other.
Yep. Any other comments? Anyone want to draw anything else out or say anything? Or...